Hi and welcome to episode 9 of Electric Transport. This episode will be a part 2 of why the Model Y will be such a disruption. Last time we looked at the SUV and crossover market and how it was actually much bigger than the passenger sedan or saloon market. The SUV market being the largest segment of vehicles isn't the only reason the Model Y will be so disruptive. It also ticks a lot of boxes for consumers, and I think it will be Tesla's best-selling vehicle. Now let's deep dive into why the Tesla Model Y will likely be so disruptive. As of today, March 14th, 2020, Model Y has already started delivering. It's important to note that this was a feat in of itself. This is less than a year after the launch, which is incredibly fast. Most manufacturers take years from launch to production to actual delivery. So why will the Model Y be so disruptive? Let's see what else is out there and compare to understand the landscape. Let's take a look at the competition. This is the market for SUVs and crossovers, looking at the quarterly sales in Canada for 2019. You can see the top contenders are Mercedes-Benz with their GLC class, and Audi occupies 3 positions, which is nice. It's Q5, Q3, and excitingly enough, an electric contender, which is the Audi e-tron. This episode, we're going to have a look at comparing the Model Y to some of the representatives of the market for SUV and crossovers. That will be the Mercedes GLC, the Audi Q5, and the Toyota RAV4. I picked the Toyota RAV4 because it's not represented in the luxury class, but I still think it's worth looking at because it is one of the top selling SUVs in the market. What makes a vehicle disruptive? Well, it needs to check off boxes for consumers. It needs to have a function that aligns itself with the type of utility that a consumer is looking for. It needs to be cost effective, and by cost effective, most consumers forget to look at the total cost of ownership. And then there's the subjective aesthetic appeal, which comes down to the design of the vehicle. So let's look at the contenders. For starters, we have the Audi Q5, then we have the Mercedes GLC 43 class, and then we'll add the more affordable Toyota RAV4, and we'll compare all of those to the Model Y. If we look at the different SUVs, starting with range, you can see that they're all very similar. They're all between 500 and 600 kilometers. And obviously, the fuel sources are different. The Tesla would be electric, charging a battery, and the others would all be tanks of fuel. But it really doesn't matter. It's still, the range is the range. Now, if we look at acceleration, you can see that Tesla is quite a bit quicker than all the others. But the range is pretty similar. It's all between, let's say, the extreme of 3.7 seconds and the RAV4 at 8.2 seconds. But this isn't an entire surprise since the RAV4 is the less expensive. Now let's look at the dimensions of the vehicle itself. So when people look for SUVs or crossovers, they're typically looking for cargo capacity and passenger capacity, of course. But if you compare the different sizes of all the different vehicles, you can see they're all pretty similar. Give or take a few centimeters, they all have similar lengths, widths, and heights. Now considering ground clearance. So another function of SUV or crossover is some people like to take them off-road. So ground clearance is quite important. And you can see that they all vary, but they're pretty tightly comparable between 6 and 8.5 inches. Ironically, the RAV4 seems to be the highest at 8.4 inches. Now, obviously, when it comes to function, the other important parameter is the cargo space. So if you include the rear seats that can be folded down in all vehicles, it seems that Toyota's RAV4 wins this particular parameter by having 1,977 liters for cargo space, followed shortly by Tesla Model Y at 1,919. So in terms of function, how does the Tesla Model Y rate compared to its other competitive SUVs in the market? It appears that it does quite well. It has a very similar range at 507 kilometers. It has the highest acceleration of any of the SUVs. Dimensions wise, it's very, very similar, give or take a few centimeters. It looks like it's as long, wide, and high as many of its other counterparts. And in addition, it has excellent cargo space and good ground clearance. So in terms of function, it'll probably tick off all the boxes for consumers when they're looking at different SUVs. So now let's have a look at total cost of ownership. So this is an example of the prices in the Canadian market. And if you convert everything to American dollars, it would be very similar. So you can see here that the RAV4 is by far the most economical choice for SUV, and it's probably one of the reasons that's driving its sales to be one of the best sellers in the market. The Model Y, on the other hand, is comparable to the Mercedes GLC and the Q5 in terms of cost, and it's where it's likely going to compete in that luxury market. But I included RAV4 for a reason, and you'll see what I mean in a minute. So let's take the prices and we'll look at 84 months financing and comparing them right across the board. So you can see, not surprisingly, the RAV4 is the least expensive per month to finance, and then it goes up accordingly. Now let's have a look at maintenance. Now, if you recall, we discussed the costs of maintenance comparing electric cars to ICE vehicles in a previous episode. The cost of maintenance for an electric vehicle is considerably lower. So if you look here, the estimated cost of annual maintenance for a Model Y is $196. Compare that to the other competitive vehicles. You can see that they're between $1,300, $1,200, all the way up to $1,600, let's say, for a Mercedes per year. So that's a significant difference. And now let's have a look at the fuel. If you recall in our previous episode, we discussed looking at the difference between fuel costs. So the cost per kilowatt hour to be able to charge the battery compared to the cost of a liter of fuel is also considerable. So the estimated cost to fuel your electric vehicle is about $436, whereas for an ICE vehicle, you're in the thousands range. Now, if you add everything up together, you can see the total annual cost for owning the vehicles tells quite an interesting story. Compare the Model Y, which is a more expensive vehicle, to the RAV4. You can see that the total annual cost is about half for the Model Y. So this is a little bit surprising. It means that your Tesla Model Y is actually going to be cheaper to own and run than a RAV4. And this is where I think things become disruptive. When people start crunching through the numbers and doing the math on this, they realize that the Model Y is actually cheaper per month than anything else. Now, I haven't even taken depreciation into account because there is some evidence to show that electric vehicles depreciate at a much lower rate than ICE vehicles. So this means the differences between the costs would be even greater. Now, interestingly enough, if you look at the difference between the Model Y and all the other different vehicles that are listed in this graph, you can see that the differences per year are actually quite significant. The difference between, for example, a Mercedes and the Model Y per year is $3,390. And then even a RAV4, which is the cheaper of the options, the difference, the RAV4 is actually going to cost you $1,411 more per year. So if you tally things up over 5 years, you can see that the differences become quite significant. For the RAV4, it's a $7,000 more expensive vehicle than a Model Y. And for a Mercedes, it's a $16,000 increase in cost. So what does this mean for the Model Y in the competitive space of the SUV and crossover market? It means that it will be disruptive because it checks off a lot of boxes. It checks off the function box because it has the clearance and the off-road capabilities and the acceleration and the cargo space and the people space to be a very, very competitive option for a lot of people looking for an SUV. And it also checks off the cost box because it's very competitively priced, and because it's an electric vehicle, the total cost per of ownership per year is actually significantly lower when you compare it to other ICE vehicles in this category. Now, what about design? So aesthetics is obviously a very subjective parameter, and it's very difficult to quantify. It's just a matter of personal taste. I will say this, the Model Y is exceptionally well designed. It looks like it's not just a Model 3 stretched vertically. It actually has some very unique features like a huge cargo space when you lower the seats, as well as some remote switches for the seats to lower. It has some very cleverly designed features like collision avoidance, which is well beyond the technology of any other vehicle in its class. And in addition, it seems like it will seat 5 people extremely comfortably and even have enough room for a third row and be able to seat 7 people. Now, this isn't a new feature, but it is something worth noting that it is capable of doing. So far, we've been talking about the Model Y as comparing apples to apples with all the other vehicles in the market. However, we haven't addressed the elephant in the room, and that is that there is a huge difference between these vehicles, and that is the Model Y is the only SUV and crossover which offers 0 emissions. Now, I've tried my best not to politicize these episodes, and I will continue to avoid that because I don't want it to become a political rant. But, nevertheless, it's a fact that climate change is real. The change is occurring more rapidly than scientists originally thought even a few years ago. And the planet is potentially at a point where changes are becoming irreversible. Much of the world is reacting appropriately to this by banning burning of fossil fuels and changing their transportation models. North America is behind the game. They're slow to adopt these policies, but there is more and more evidence mounting, and cities are making changes, even though federal governments seem to be much slower, and especially in the States because of the current administration. Now, apart from climate change, there are also health consequences to CO2 being released by combustion engines.
Atlanta is well known for bad traffic. Now new data showing that children are impacted the most by traffic pollution. Researchers at George Washington University link traffic pollution to 4 million new cases of childhood asthma worldwide.